Alright, I'm going to show you guys how to go through the different suspension types on your model. So you can see here I've loaded up the 730 Camaro, and it has double wishbone rear and a Mcpherson Strut front. So you can see the T, U, and L points. So the L is your lower pivot. You can change this point type up here in the top right to a vertex, which is your vertex points. Thrust bearing, upper pivot point, and a lower pivot point. And this is where the suspension is going to connect to these points on the car. I can turn masses off and show you a visual. So the suspension basically looks like this. And you can see the arms pivot about those points. And your shock is up there. To give you an idea. To make these points, you can just press in your frame editor up here, you can just press new point and it'll create a point at your origin, and you can move it using the blue arrows along the axes. Changing this up here as point type. It starts off as a vertex already, but you can make it a lower, upper, and thrust. And depending on where it's located in the car, if it's more forward or rear, if it's close to the rear, the rear tires will automatically connect to that point. The game understands that you're trying to make a pivot point there, and if it's closer to the front wheels, it will make a connection there. So, point. So I'll show you kind of how they both work. So for the double wishbone suspension, you can create 2 points. You're going to need to have at least an upper pivot point for it to connect to. You're going to need a lower pivot point, and you're going to need a thrust bearing. You can basically make as many of these as you really want. Sometimes I'll even make 2 lower and upper pivot points. Just by duplicating the point, you can drag it over, and it understands that there's 2 lower and upper pivot points. If you're making a open wheel race car, it's cool to do. If you want the tubes to be visible, so when I go back into my normal here, it's hard to see, but from underneath you can't see the tubes. You can't see the connections. You can click the tubes, which are these blue dots, and on the right here, for suspension components, you can make a visible tube. You can turn that on, and they will turn yellow. So turn these on, go back to the car, and you can now see, you can actually see your suspension points. I'm going to turn these off. So once you've created these points, you can just reset, or the game will automatically connect these points to the wheel. By pressing Shift L or turning on this suspension diagram here to the left, turn that on, you can get a front-on view of the double wishbone suspension or the Mcpherson front. There's a lot of tuning you can do. I highly recommend just Googling, looking up some of these characteristics and finding out suspension tuning and what that can do to help improve the feel and drive of your model and mod. There's a lot of cool information you can find that can really help your car improve and just be much better in drive in general. I see a lot of people not taking a lot of time into their suspension setups. So I'm aiming to help with that. So basically, setting that up, you can do a no springs test, which basically puts your suspension on the bump stops. So when you turn that on, you can see it goes to its lowest point in the shock travel. So when I say no zero or zero springs test, and I turn that to yes, the car basically bottoms out to as low as it can possibly get. You can see in suspension that this point here, if I turn this off, and now my motion range is about 0.1 of a meter. If I go to 0, where it bottoms out, you can see when I do no suspension test in the rear, there's no change. Since it's already at 0 motion range, this is bottomed out. It can't go any more, it'll clip through the fender here, but in game you notice that it's not changing from 0. So in game the 0 point is right there. And then you can see if I go this way, it says I now have motion range. So put it back to that. I'll mention this now. Zero springs test, you turn that on when adjusting your max up point. So this is as far up the shock can travel. This is the max up it can go. So you can make that wherever you need to be. You usually don't want it to be here, since you would be clipping through the fender at the bottoming out points. So I try to keep it where even if the player is adjusting setup, if they decided to run no camber or a positive camber for any reason, that it still won't clip through the fender in most cases. Sometimes it'll still clip, that's just kind of how it is. But I try to go by rule of thumb to give a little bit of space for air, that it won't clip through the fenders and look a little weird. So that's basically it there. For editing the suspension here for the rear double wishbone, you have some options over here. You have your lower arm length. You can adjust this using a slider or with the points. You can just drag these and you'll notice that the lower arm lengths are getting longer, which is changing my camber characteristics and just neutral handling characteristics. Even though I'm set to, or should be set to, 0 camber front and rear. A good rule of thumb that I go by is I set my default setup to 0 front and 0 rear camber, and try to get a very neutral camber settings on the default setup in the editor here. And then after, you can go in and tweak your negatives and positives. It just gives a better representation of when you go into negative degrees and positive, it will reflect that over here in the live view nicer. So I'll give you an example. So lower arm length, like I said, can go long or short. Same with the upper arm lengths up here. They can be long or short. You have your offset, your virtual spacers, basically. This just offsets the wheel from the hub. So you can see if I go into Shift L, it's a good way to see my scrub radius with the offset changes many different things. Back slightly. I'll move these in a little. So you just get them to a point that you like them. Make uppers up, bring the lowers in, and I recommend pressing space to reset the car. That'll reset your live camber adjustment feed here, because there is tire friction and tire kind of modulation and stretch in the editor. So when I move my lower arm length, I'll give you an example. When I pull it like this, you see the tires being pulled. So it says right now for my rear, I'm at -6 degrees of camber. But when I reset, I'm actually at nearly -11 degrees of camber. So it's a big difference. So you should always press space, reset your car, just to see what the actual numbers are at static height. So we'll definitely bring that back in and reset it. So -1 degrees looks pretty good. I'll even put the uppers a little bit longer, just so it's a static -0.8 degrees. It's pretty neutral. So I like it there. If I do 0 springs, I can see that's not clipping and there's a decent amount of gap. So I'll turn that off. A good rule of thumb for the double wishbone suspension is when you do your suspension travel, you should see a negative camber gain. The more the shock travels, the more load on one side. So you can see I start off with a -0.8 degrees, and by the bottom of the shock, I'm at -3 degrees of camber. So it's a slight camber gain the more load is on the shock, which is good. It's good for in-corner kind of balance and grip. So I'll show you how to adjust now So actually I should say the half uprights. So when you adjust your wheel size, so if I change the wheel size here to a, let's say we want it 13-inch wheels. So if I go back to suspension, you'll see now it says my half upright is too long. So you can see here it's clipping into the wheel. So all you gotta do, drag this down until it no longer screams at you. And you have a little bit of adjustment that you can kind of play with in that range. But then there's a point where it gets too short. It's not big enough for the wheel. So you want to just have it somewhere in there. Don't want 13s, we'll go back to 16s. And now this is too short again, I'll raise that up. And now that fixes my camber adjustment. Forward, show you that. Forward is pretty straightforward. You can just drag this, it just moves the wheel. It does not move your points, does not move your pivot points. So when you drag the wheel back and forth, these points stay stationary. So you got to remember, if you are adjusting your wheel within reason, you may need to move these points to better reflect where the wheel is. That can be a big issue with the fronts here. I'll show you that now. Actually, with the front, if I were to move it forward with the Mcpherson Strut, the Mcpherson Strut doesn't get adjusted through here really when you're adjusting your caster. So you adjust caster by moving your thrust bearing in this view. So you can see the green dots here for the hub are actually rotating. So this is a caster adjustment. If you'd like to do this on the rears, you got to go to your steering adjustments, and you'll see a caster adjustment for the rear here, and you can see my caster is increasing and decreasing with this slider. The green dots in a line, gaining more caster, less is straight up and down. And you can see it reflects that with the pivot points, they turn and move to reflect that. Whereas the Mcpherson Strut system only requires no upper pivot and only has the thrust bearing and lower pivot point. But in order to adjust your caster settings, there's no adjustment here. You have to move it in the editor, in the frame editor. So you can adjust that here to whatever you would like. Making sure not to go too far. There's negative consequences to giving too much caster. As you can see, when I now turn the wheel with almost maybe 30 degrees of caster, I'd say, or more, the wheel acts almost as a bike, where the fork is so offset, the wheels kind of pivot on a weird sort of axis. Just looks very weird and handles really oddly. So not something you maybe want to do. More of a neutral caster is good. And lower pivot, the exact same thing. You can adjust that using suspension, so it's only a lower arm length adjustment. So you can move this out, move it in, and then space to reset your wheels, check your tires. So fronts are -1, that looks fine to me, and I can press S, go back in here, make sure this is centered in the wheel arch. I like to press R when I'm doing modeling like this, and adjust my front and back. And the car looks good. So you can also do the included angle on either side. This is just included angle if you want to have like your, let's say, lower arm lengths were longer. So I have a lot of negative camber right now. And say I didn't want to go into my setup. So in my setup to account for this, I'd have to run, I could do only so much positive camber, and it's not going to adjust the wheel enough to where I would like it. But I really like how this suspension diagram, how this four-link system looks. I want it to work like this. It gives me good camera gain on corner entry or something like that. It just functions well. So what you can do included angle, and that's just an already included angle to the wheel, which just allows you to run these different hub setups and kind of adjust the wheel to your liking. If you want it more straight up, but you want it a kind of a different sort of angle on the hub and the lower arm length. If I wanted that a lot longer than the uppers, I can kind of do something like this where that will fix that, and now I still have my rear adjustment relatively decent. I think that's it for that. I'll show you now converting to linear. So linear suspension is the most basic and relatively unrealistic for most cars. It's a completely linear system. There's no camber gain on corners or on load. It's just completely straight up and down. So if I go zero springs test, you'll notice that there's no rotation. It is just up and down shocks, and the negative live camber gain is staying neutral. There's no change at all in the wheels. These actually convert to, they convert the trailing arms in game, which can be very weird. They can have some weird effects. Usually they're pretty good. I think it just says trailing arm in game, but that is something to look out for. But if you're not able to fit proper suspension on the car, if you're building something really small, it may kind of bug out. So linear might be an option you have to go with. Nothing bad. There's not really much to adjust. You can do track width and just change that. The offset works the same, but the offset is now the offset. Basically works the same way, but it's moving the offset of the shock in relation to the wheel instead of the wheel in relation to the hub and the shock. Inclination, just the inclination of the shock. You have your caster, which is caster, that angle, and the rest you already know. Max up, your forward, back, and your half uprights. Same with the front. There's really not much to it. It's pretty simple. Your offset all works out the same. Can get a little funky. I'll see now. I think that's basically it for what I can do. I can do a rear trailing arm. So this should work. So the rear trailing arm, I don't think needs a upper pivot. Delete these tubes. Oh, it did not like that. Tube. Yeah, so it doesn't need a, it does not need uppers. Delete the point. So there we go. Oh, it's starting to freak out a little bit. So it does not need, it just needs a lower pivot point. And so what it does here is your wheel, when you lower the suspension, will rotate about that point. It'll rotate about your lower pivot point, wherever you set it. So it acts as a rear trailing arm, if you can picture that. So it's rotating, as you can see, it's rotating about that L. Wherever I put it, it's trying to rotate. So now it's going in this direction. It's rotating in that direction when the shock compresses. So this is good for maybe trucks, or we did this on the trophy truck model I helped make. So that's also an option. That is that. There is also rigid, but rigid is only for karts. Rigid is basically what you think it is. It's no suspension at all. It's just a fixed kind of point, very stiff, hard suspension. And if you're working on a motorbike or bicycle of any kind, you can use the front fork, and that's for the front wheels only, and that would be for bikes and such. And that is it for suspension options.